welcome, you're watching Gay Porn. Evola, the big meme daddy of traditionalism, would not like trans rights. His view, I can personally only see as degenerate. The food review bra look-alike in revolt against the modern moral ties the fact that one is born as distinctive of their dharma. So, it is for Evola, those who are born as men must realize themselves as men. They cannot get caught up with mixture and promiscuity. The man must act out his passive heroism, the woman her passive. A man must be a warrior, must be a man of action, a dynamo of power control. The man showing his will to order and give form, he will always pull himself up by his bootstrap as he is self-sufficient. The woman realizes herself as a mother or a lover. The woman goes to the kitchen for her liberation. We could give examples of the unethical treatment of women in the past as Evola himself collects for us, as for him they are base. For Evola, this is how a woman finds and frees herself. How not having rights until marriage is freedom, I will never understand, but Evola views this as how they become, in a kind of way, equal. That whole bit of passive versus active heroism. A woman's love sets the condition and requires reciprocated love. A man could not understand love in this way except by becoming feminine. Evola states, and while traditional ethics asks men and women to be themselves to the utmost of their capabilities and express with radical traits their own gender-related characteristics, the new civilization aims at leveling everything, since it is oriented to the formless, the state that is truly not beyond, but on the side of individuation and differentiation of the sexes. Evola, in Civilization of the Mother, that chapter, he speaks of the inverse. We see here, following from mistakes he already made, to mistakes in understanding these forms of spiritual expression. We can only follow Evola if we followed what he said before, which is hard to do. We see Evola show his degenerate views which seek to cut us from the divine when we look at some of the spiritual practices he speaks of in it. It is hard to see them as cutting us from the supernatural when, even if we buy into some of Evola's bullshit, they are constantly seeking to bring us closer to the divine. Evola holds on to a power trip of war-filled heterosexual intercourse and manly autogenesis. Here we can, from this, and along with how he speaks on feminism, imagine how Evola would think of transgenderism. To this, I point out the spiritual reasons why one may change their gender. After all, we know about the Magna Mater cults in Rome and the priests who underwent sex changes. However, I found a really great example reading another traditionalist, Augustus Sinavinus. Speaking of the role on prophecy in Mesopotamia, he quotes the Dutch scholar Cornel van der Koen. Ishtar was deemed capable to produce by way of ecstasy a metamorphosis in her worshippers. Men might be turned into women and women into men. There is evidence that at least some Neo-Assyrian priestesses were in fact really men, or rather self-castrated transvestites. Their outward appearance was interpreted as a display of Ishtar's transforming powers. Possessed by the divine, they were the obvious persons who have become mouthpieces of the god. Augustus Sinavinus states 2 paragraphs before, the quote, those mediated between the divine council and the earthly court are given titles like answerers, statics, cult singers, and called ones. These cult singers had an important political role. These Braha-loving queens of Mesopotamia, bringing messages from the gods, and so are taken very seriously in matters of politics, although subordinated to other means of divine communication. These holy thigh-high-wearing answerers is something inconvenient for Evola and the closeted chasers of the right wing. They differ from modern trans people in that modern and trans persons want to become more like their gender, and these cult singers had to become more like the gender of their god. Yet we should also keep in mind in traditional views of autonomy, as Jeremy Nadler notes, the notion that we are free to choose how we act is a distinctly post-Egyptian idea first formulated in the 1st century by Aristotle. Evola speaks of similar traditions and lists them out, speaking on the civilization of the mother. In Evola minds, such traditions are fragmentary, naturalizing, and materializing. Evola himself even gives the example of people changing their gender or after becoming possessed by a goddess. Evola speaks of Germanic priests cross-dressing. For Evola, they are fragmentary, naturalizing, and materializing as they are feminizing. They are, as Evola sees it, killing off the male, even when the male, like in some examples he gives, is of ritualistic importance. Evola can give an example of unity with a supernatural deity and call it fragmentizing, naturalizing, and materializing, and cutting us from the supernatural. The fact people can read him and take him seriously is a refutation of the Cartesian maxim, they don't think, yet they are. We start to see how old trans people are, and I put in quotation marks there for a reason, and how long they have been around. It seems that Eastern Orthodoxy is the big fad amongst trad fags these days, so I will give an example, a Byzantine example, Milos the monk. Milos was born Merida and wanted to become a monk, so he changed his name to Milos. When he died, the other monks were surprised to find no banana, proving him innocent of an accusation that he fathered a child. So, I have a question. If someone like Milos can dedicate their whole life to God, should you tell them to join the 41% like all the closeted chasers of the right wing tell trans people to do? The gynophilic trad fags of the right wing seem unable to love anyone who is queer, even if they themselves can't stop gooning to femboy hentai. Very Christ-like of them. Milos is venerated by the Eastern Orthodox Roman Catholics. In 2022, Milos was added to the Episcopal Church liturgical calendar. It is also often in ancient history that not everyone has gender. Not just in the way that in a male-dominated society, gender becomes something that practically only applies to women, as many feminists have pointed out. An ancient gender is affected by that attitude too. Aristotle, who was intensely concerned with the sex of free men and women, recognized no sex among slaves. Slaves are without sex because their gender does not matter politically. No. Thomas Lacour. Plato too, we know, at times dismissed the distinction between the sexes when elsewhere it was critical. Aristotle is, of course, a strong gender essentialist, but one where not everyone needs have gender. In Aristotle's strongly sexist gender essentialism, in which social categories are natural and on the same level as physical laws, the biology may even exist thanks to the social, drives into, even if not on simple reading, what Lacour calls the one-sex model. It seems, moreover, the great mystics don't want the first men to be warriors, like how Evola places men. In fact, they often prescribe the feminine. We see this when the great Meister Eckhart speaks of the virgin who is also a wife. We use the feminine as man is made to receive God. As the beautiful Eckhart says, one must be innocent and virgin if one is to receive the innocent Jesus. But, as Eckhart points out, the virgin bears no fruit, and to be fruitful you must be a wife. He says wife is the optimum term that can be applied to the soul. It is even above virgin. If man is to receive God, he must be a virgin, but to be fruitful, he must be a wife. We see Eckhart move from male to female pronouns. We see how Evola's views start to become degenerate as they seek to make the gap between us and God bigger. Eckhart states, the virgin who is a wife free and unfettered in affection is equally near both to God and to self. She brings forth much fruit, and it's big withal, no less and no more than God himself is. A virgin who is a wife accomplishes this birth, bears fruit every day 100-fold or 1,000-fold. Yes, she gives birth times without number and bears fruit from the most fertile soil. We see a fact about the female coming about when Eckhart speaks of the virgin wife. This is also explored clearly by Proclus, Iamblichus, and others. Neoplatonism arguably being the most important philosophy for traditionalists. When Renaissance humanists like Michel Ficino, Giordano Bruno, and Pico della Milandra begin to look for the perennial philosophy, it is big thanks to a new interest in Hermeticism, Platonism, and the Kabbalah. Many look at these topics that had such a big influence on these Renaissance humanists and come out with very simplistic and reductionist readings of their takes on gender. We see this when Evola, when his opening on the chapter on sex and gender, Evola, he talks about the monad and the dyad, the monad with its manly autogenesis and the dyad of differentiation. Evola also misunderstanding the fall, which we will talk about later, in saying the woman is often considered the principle of sin. If anything, gender itself is the problem. We also see this in the LARP known as the Kabbalion. After making the correct distinction between sex and gender, it says that the male is positive and the female is negative. There is more to these esoteric traditions than these would lead on. The feminist Danielle A. Lane, who has 2 articles on Proclus and Neoplatonic that you should go look at, starting with Proclus. He gives the female a progressive mediating power. The female is not just some object for the male to force himself onto when she isn't getting in the way and being sinful. This is not how Proclus thinks of it. The great manly demiurge, before it undergoes its great manly task, it will enter into the oracular shrine of night to fill himself with divine thoughts from there. Night being female, we see in this Platonic story of male penetration something subversive in this insemination. Night's advice is what plants the seeds in the demiurge. We see how those Italian anti-feminist, word-lusting modernists, under the name of futurists, in their homoerotic attempt to worship masculinity, in truth worship the animated and dynamic feminine. The feminine, far from being the source of sin, gives fruit, life, and animation. Proclus writes, the intelligible living being includes both male and female simultaneously, for these sexes are present in every order of living thing in appropriate manner, and it is necessary the primary heads of these sexes pre-exist within a single comprehension of living things. From the dyad of male and female comes forth the living things that result in it also being established as a triad. The single form living being itself exists up there, and so does the dyad male and female. Proclus even speaks of people being born in the wrong body. He gives the examples of Messias and Sybil. These examples show that Proclus did not have a modern idea of a trans person. Why I put it in quotation marks earlier, as Greeks had no idea of transgender, homosexual, or queer. We don't find one-to-ones to our modern ideas of things. Think back to the Mesopotamian example. It wasn't their gender identity they were affirming, but it was the influence of the gods. However, if such lunar or Apollonian souls are in the opposite body, only makes sense for them to follow their lunar or Apollonian nature. It seems weird to me to exclude them from following what seems to be the Dharma. The objection given to trans people is often teleological. The two-witted trans folks like Evola say that because you have a dick, you must play out the role of a man. This is your telos. Why? It is because the transphobe doesn't care about facts, as will become clear when we talk about modern science and teleology on the topic. Transphobes melt when you come at them with facts and logic. Moving to Plotinus, the leading Lane gives of Plotinus in the first article needs to be challenged. However, it seems that he herself has done just this. Speaking of his track on love, Plotinus sees at the source of love the tendency of the soul for pure beauty, but it has left the noose and is born in the psyche. Plotinus, as love in some degree, is a thing of matter and at the same time something celestial, sprung of the soul, for love lacks its good, but its spirit thrives towards it. It is poverty who brings forth the hypostasis of love. Love born of poverty lacks, but brings up to higher being. Plotinus before said the world's soul, then Aphrodite, the soul, is identical with love, the cosmos. Thus we start to see this part that bears fruit, as Eckhart says. Lane doesn't talk about it, but I feel like talking about the trap, nature, contemplation, and the one. Lane points out there is a lack of gendered language, that the Greek words woman and man don't show up much in Plotinus at all. However, it does appear when Plotinus put these words into the mouth of nature. Nature tells us that they draw nothing unlike the mathematician. They simply glaze, and matter takes being from their contemplation. As my mother, the all-soul, and the beings that brought me, they are born of contemplation. My birth is from them. The problem with the quote Lane gave in the first article is that it is about matter, which, as Plotinus says, mother is only used as a matter of speaking, because matter bears no fruit. It lacks what is female, unlike nature, love, or the all-soul. Iamblichus wrote the theology of arithmetic, and as we count with Iamblichus from 1 to 10, we will learn about gender in the Platonic and Pythagorean tradition. As we just opened it, so I see the problem with Evola's view. Here it says that the monad is taken to be father and mother. The monad is not, as Evola thinks, an example of male autogenesis, but is beyond gender. Evola is right that in the dyad there is differentiation, and we also call it nature since it is movement towards being. The pentad is comprehensive of natural phenomenon, is the marriage of male and female, but there is something really queer in the hexad. The hexad is androgynous, thus most suited to the soul. Like the triad, we find great harmony, as also we find peace and reconciliation. It is written that the perfection of the universe falls under the hexad. The virtue of the creator god is also rightly thought to be hexadic. Looking at the the Neoplatonic tradition, in spite of whatever personal views these authors and men may have held, something radically queer. Plato and Timaeus may attribute being born as a woman to moral failure, and Plato may, as well as Plotinus from the tone and on love, view sodomy as a violation of natural teleology. Yet that doesn't change the equality and queerness we find. Evola seemed to have only gave a superficial look at gender in these traditions and picked what he wanted. In the Platonic tradition, we find, to quote Lane, neither of these terms, masculine and feminine, exist independently, free of mixture, as Aphrodite has a place in the intellect and Zeus a place in the soul, the divine, masculine and feminine, co-determining, always becoming what they are through their interchange, desiring the same, homosexuality, while also desiring the other, heterosexuality. In short, there is a radical queerness or mixture of sex, gender, and sexuality at the very heart and height of what it means to be human and the very core of reality and life. Moving to the Egyptian mysteries, Venus in his amazing book, Philosophy as Verberg, makes the comparison between the Egyptian mysteries and Platonic philosophy. He says none can be regarded as the one, the great solar Ra, as Nu, Osiris with the duat as the Psyche. I would like to add Nut and Geb within the cosmology of Humanism, the androgynous or bisexual as whom, who is the principle of primordial unity, generates duality from himself. We see also the god Shu and Tefnu. From the sexual union of Shu and Tefnu, we get the birth of Nut and Geb. Geb being most like what Plotinus speaks of when he speaks of matter. Geb is weak, wanting sexual union with none. In the cosmology of Hermopolis, Geb is cucked by Shu. Geb is longing for that being which comes down from the divine. Matter in Plotinus lacks important parts of the female and is longing for the being which it lacks. Geb being male, he lacks the female aspect which makes the higher nun so great. If he is the great mother who clothes all beings in their spiritual form, then it is Geb who gives them material embodiment. We see how Nun is not submissive and far from the principle of sin, as it is Geb who broke off from the sexual union. We find also even the manly great Ra cannot stand on his own, to the extent that Ra is manifest in the sun, his daughter, in reality his granddaughter. Nun is also necessarily his mother. From the division of these two, we get Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. Seth, who is male, we see the Egyptians attribute their enemies of Sethian qualities. The Egyptians, not believing in free will, see Seth as causing people to be violent, savage, alcoholic, licentious. This is not totally sinful, however, as we see in the festival of Nankut, as Jeremy Nadler describes it, at the sowing of the field, the symbolic attachment to the death of Osiris. Seth spreads the seeds into the ground. We see how this destruction forms a greater good, this being the best of all possible worlds. Seth is what is destructive in matter. Osiris, on the other hand, encompasses the inner world known as the duat. Osiris with the duat is the source of the forms. Here there is both the source of the forms and its destruction. The cosmology we find in Hermopolis is much more manly. One may even think that there is male autogenesis, but to let Evola down we can't. The manlier cosmology we find is think of the greater worship. Ra and Thoth. Ra, who is also a tomb, is at the start. Creation is still a tomb's act of masturbation. So there is this seeming autogenesis of Ra, that however sadly is still not male autogenesis. In the cosmology of Mephis, there is much less room for gender, as the creative role of Hat takes up all the room. Hat takes the form of the androgynous tomb. We don't find Evola's views on gender in any of these myths. With the Egyptians, we see sex and masturbation as a huge ritualistic and symbolic symbol, along with the Egyptians being a very libertine people. That other tradition from the Jews seems to be somewhat lacking in its view on women and its metaphysics. The highest is still beyond gender, and self was referred to by the Kabbalists as the most ancient of ancient. It was always considered to be sexless. We still don't find in that male autogenesis, and we start to see a match with some of Evola's views on women, as in the Rana Menta, it says that the female Sakina has nothing from itself and it only receives being from the Sephiroth. In the Platonic tradition, we saw female insemination of the male, and we also saw it in Egypt. But here we see something a little different. Here the sakina bears fruit, but only when it obeys the male. Here it is the origin of sin, yet Evola's views don't seem to totally fit here. Despite Evola's anti-Semitism, he seems to agree with more of this Jewish tradition we're from Spain than the other ones that we have looked at. It should also be pointed out that all these different views from the past have different views on the role of the body than we do. We may say that sex is gendered more than gender is sex views. In these traditional views that I speak of, it is not that gender is a social construct any more than the sky is. To make what I say more clear, I quote Jeremy Nadler: the inner and outer worlds are not so strictly partitioned, and as a result, the experience of the physical was much richer. It was infused with the inner spiritual qualities that today we would regard as subjective projection. The traditionalist writer Perez Duan states the absolute subject escapes us as much as the absolute object, hence their supreme indistinction. It was not a social construct, but in a way, the subjective was little different from the objective. The social construct here would not mean unreal, nor is there no constructed element to the sky. This act alone would change how they understood sex and gender. Their relationship to the body was different, as Thomas Lacour also points out. Earlier writers from the Greeks onward could obviously distinguish nature from culture, but as I gathered and worked through the material that forms this book, it became increasingly that it is very difficult to read ancient, medieval, Renaissance texts about the body with the epistemological lens of the Enlightenment, through which the physical world, the body, appears as something real, while its cultural meanings are phenomenological. Bodies in these texts is strange and remarkable, and to modern readers impossible things. In the future generations, writes Origen, the body would become less thick, less coagulated, as less hardened. As the spirit warmed up to God, physical bodies themselves would have been radically different. Before the fall, imagines Gregory of Nicaea, male and female coexisted in the image of God, and sexual differentiation came about only as the representation in the flesh from the fall from grace. In a 19th century Urdu guide for ladies, the Prophet Muhammad is listed as the top of the list of exemplary women. There are numerous accounts of men who are said to lactate, and pictures of the boy Jesus with breast. Girls could turn into boys, and men who associated too extensively with women could lose their hardness and definition of their more perfect bodies and regress into effeminate. In these pre-Enlightenment texts, and even some later ones, sex or the body must be understood as the epiphenomenon, while gender, what we would take to be a cultural category, was primarily real. Gender, man and woman, mattered a great deal and was part of the order of things. Sex was conventional, though modern terminology makes such a reordering nonsensical. However, we still seem to be giving off the impression of a mistake in how we frame things, as if we are only speaking of the male, the female, and the monad that is beyond sex and gender. Among the Bugis people, and I probably mispronounced their name, we find a 5-gender system. I will list those 5 genders up on the screen. Moving to the Navajo, we find a 4-gender system. List them out on the screen. Gender is a complex topic, and the history of it more so. The roles of those genders and what those genders are changes from example to example. Spanish and French settlers used the term pedate for those who did not fit into their gender mold. To sum up the native views on gender, I quote from the Indigenous feminist magazine K Info Shop. Indigenous conceptions of gender considered the mental, emotional, and social aspects of one's expression of gender identity rather than an individual's physical or biological makeup. People who would be considered trans today would not align with colonial understandings of gender. However, it goes without saying trans non-binary people have existed since time immemorial. Most recently, the pan-tribal term two-spirited, a translated term from the Anishinaabe word to reclaim indigenous trans subjectivity. Tribal communities throughout the continent have their own unique understandings and cosmologies that embrace and celebrate such subjectivity. The Wankik of Lakota, the Mahu of Kamakaoli, the Inanana of the Zuni, and the Nadole of the Dene have largely been erased and misinterpreted as our understanding and approach to gender been perverted by colonial interpretation. There is an article I'm reminded of by John Girzan, which, despite some narrative errors, is worth looking at. It is an interesting look into topics of gender symbolism and feminism. The idea is ideas may not be totally right, but it is worth the read and 100% something we must engage with. David Graeber and David Wardrow, who I've just started to read, seem to point out the problems of the neo-Rousseauian views of the author. I wish here only to point out some facts in the article. With the mentor local Pueblo, Iroquois, Crow, and other American Indian groups, women could terminate marital relationships at any time. Overall, males and females in band societies move freely and peacefully from one band to another, as well as into relationship or out of relationship. According to Russell Miles, men did not command or exploit women's labor. They exert little or no influence over women's bodies or those of their children, making no fetish of virginity or chastity, and making no demands on women's sexual exclusivity. Zambuli Banu Karachi provides an African example. Mabuti gender associations were characterized by harmony and collaboration. It is true that researchers Kelnar Nathan did not find much gender speculation among hunter-gatherers in Western India compared to agriculturalists there. I may not know much about anthropology and am not educated on it, as you may be able to tell from my sources. However, John Juzan should also keep in mind there is not much that we can say about gender before symbolism. David Graeber and Wardrow Graeber, who do a masterful attack on views like Juzan's, I think, also point to an often overlooked fact that in the origins of liberalism, there is a large influence of Native Americans. We see that the differing views of sex and gender was noted by the colonists, as I've kind of already hinted. Horrified at the sexual liberty of the natives, the Christian missionary Gabriel Staggart became convinced that all the women wanted to sleep with him and he had to protect his virginity at all costs. When Madame de Gaffney wrote her feminist landmark letter from a Peruvian woman, it was written from the perspective of Zila, kidnapping the princess because of the differing relationship between men and women found in America. The impact of colonialism on the exchange of political and social ideas. Without said colonialism, we would not have liberalism, feminism, communism, anarchism, as we have come to know them from the American natives that Frejuan loved so much. We get a lot of these ideas that are also important to note. A lot of the ideas that Fred can be painted as traditional in the right context. The earliest ideas of the separation for church and state were motivated by deep Augustinianism and apostolic poverty. There were practically anarchist communes in the Middle Ages. With new findings in Roman law, came to love democracy and thinking proto-liberal thoughts. There was also a lot of proto-liberal economic thinking coming about in the medieval Islamic world. I bring this up for 2 points. Evola misunderstanding the roots of humanism, and something doesn't have to be old to fit in with tradition. Heterosexuality is relatively new. Heterosexuality is less than 200 years old, but if you would argue with most people, I don't think they would argue that it is an offense to tradition for people to delude themselves into thinking they are heterosexual. Moreover, people have always been having sex. That's how we got here. There has always been those whose gender has been different from their sex. Transgenderism is modern, but that does not make it an offense to tradition. Evola would agree that tradition is not about any particular expression, but about the motivations that allowed those expressions to exist. Now, for Evola, humanism and individualism lead to the integration of the family, modern sensuality, immediate sexual gratification, as well as the masculization of the woman and her emancipation. Evola comes to this view from the most absurd analysis. Evola thinks the first form of humanism was individualism, but this does not show the individualism in the early humanists. In fact, the great humanists of the Renaissance, we find great lovers of tradition. We find these humanists often value traditional knowledge over their own. One cannot help but hear a love of tradition in this line from Pico della Mirando's oration on the dignity of man. Since it is not granted to us flesh as we are, and knowledgeable only of things of the earth, let us have recourse to the ancient fathers. Pico goes on to cite Orpheus, Zoroaster, the Chaldeans, Pythagoras, Enoch, and others to show off his love for tradition. The humanists were looking for the same perennial truth Evola wants. In men like Pico della Mirandola, we find humanism nothing like Sartre. The unrealism which Evola speaks of, in which the real becomes identical to the rational, one may think that sounds like philosophical realism, but terms mean nothing to Evola, and Evola will use them however he feels. Evola views Christianity as the roots of humanism, which there is a case to be made for that, but Evola is not the man to make it. He says Christianity is the root of humanism, as it somehow seeks to remove initiation from religion. He then only looks at Protestantism, but does not do a good job of explaining how the Reformation took us to our modern unrealism, as he calls it, or to individualism. Evola could have tried to answer the ever-interesting question of how we got to our modern views, but he didn't seem to care. I'm sorry, Evola, but Martin Luther, who infamously calls reason a whore, is not a rationalist or any root of rationalism. Protestantism needs to be understood to answer the question of how we got to the modern worldview, and we find that Protestantism had freed consciousness from the guardianship of the church only to bother it to the state. We find that Protestantism forgot the words of Paul in Corinthians and put the letter that killeth over the spirit that giveth life. We find that the more complacent the reformers showed themselves to the new masters, the farther they became removed from the revolutionary movement of the people, and definitely arrayed against them. That what was accomplished was the reconciliation of religion and law, as Hegel later chose to call it. The new theology was taught by the lawyers, the dead letter learnings that killed consciousness. The thrones were transformed into an altar in which man was sacrificed to the new idols. Evola wants to show unrealism by quoting an often misunderstood line from Hegel's philosophy of right. This infamous line has been explained by the translator M.M. Knott in his translator's note as what Hegel means by actuality is, as Knott states, the synthesis of essence and existence. Hegel himself wants to clarify this meaning in point 9 of his encyclopedia and states that his critic would have done well to consider the sense in which I employ it. Hegel is getting at the natural teleology so loved by traditional ethics. This way he can say things like people who are too fastidious urge the finite never reach actuality. That this is natural teleology becomes more clear when Hegel speaks on the notion and says, hence the subject itself is differentiation unto its universality or object nature, what it ought to be, and the particular constitution of its existence. Moreover, Hegel is no rationalist but a mystic. When Franz von Bülow showed Hegel Meister Eckhart, who Evola seems to like, he said, we have what we want. Even if he says he makes his head turn, his love for Jakob Böhme is well known. Hegel's so-called logic is no matrixer or calculus ratiocinator. He did not care to do a proper logic as a rationalist would be. He is Frege, Russell. We're all doing logic and Hegel something else. We read the science of logic to find that he was doing a studying to determination. The shape, quantum, negation, and essence of determinate being. To show Hegel is no rationalist, we need only look to point 486 of his phenomenology. As we see here, what Hegel calls enlightenment upsets the house. Keeping in the household of faith, faith finds itself alienated and the spirit cannot deny its own. Faith finds itself the object of pure insight, and we find ourselves flying into the unknowable absolute being and principle of unity. Now we are at the stage where faith and enlightenment are overturned in that mystical pure insight that we call absolute freedom. I would also like to speak of Baron Burris Unskol, who in his diaries recalls his meeting with Hegel. Hegel tells Unskol, as he states in the encyclopedia, philosophy is essentially the same as religion. Religion, Hegel says, is intuitive philosophy, which is in turn nothing other than cognized religion. Writes the Estonian nobleman. Hegel shows his love for religion on his first meeting with this man. We could also point to the negative theology in Hegel, because negative theology is inherently irrational. I must also say to Evola, there is no reason to bring up Hegel, as he brings nothing new to the table. It's funny about Hegel, how unoriginal he is, despite how much he views himself at the ultimate point of philosophy. Herbert Marcuse had a great line calling him Aristotle, but adapted to the rationalism of his time. The error is that Hegel is not adapting Aristotle for the logic of his time, rather stating what has already been discovered by Aristotle and Neoplatonists, but adding additional autism and dressing it up in new artistic verbiage without the same level of depth Moreover, he seemingly just ignored any developments in logic of his own time that would be problematic for his views. The one time Schopenhauer actually addresses Hegel and doesn't just name call him. In the first quote, Ruth, on the principle of sufficient reason, this is what he points out. Indeed, the quote Evola gives from Hegel is in line with tradition. The traditionalist, where Schuon would write, the notion of being is either a relatively direct reflection of pure intellect or else an indirect trace of being and reason. In Egypt, we hear how Thoth utters the thoughts from the heart. Egyptian hieroglyphs are forms of things that constitute all manifest reality. In fact, manifestation itself. Hegel is then not far from tradition. Then there's the fact Evola is just wrong about humanism leading to the disintegration of the family, individualism, gender nonconformity, feminism, and all that fun stuff. Evola needs to explain the link and how humanism went from longing for tradition to wanting to destroy it. There is none of that given by Evola. There could be an interesting history of humanism given on how we went from men like Pico della Mirandola to men like Sartre, as humanism of these two men is of two totally different forms. But Evola is not going to do that. There has been pointed out, the Native American influence on feminism and other things. And so I would like to point out another fact about the Native American attack on in European society. The two Davises don't do the best job at pointing it out, but there does seem to be a lesser degree of humanism in the Native attack. We see in the Native attack on Christianity. In Christian humanism, it is key, as Clementine of Alexandria said, that man became God, so God may become man. However, to the Native American, how could God become man, and Mormonism being false? How could he not show himself to us? They rejected that God could even lower himself to become man. This is an important part that leads to those ideas of people. Moving on to the last point about traditional views on sex and gender, before we move over to modern science, Neoplatonic gives us a quote from professor at the University of Michigan, Albo Rapp, who will be starting with Orphism and the Orphic cult, and this will show us something important about the fall. The Orphic mystery purports to be an esoteric tradition, one that liberates people from the petrifying conventions of the mass sex gender machine. Its purpose is to recreate the subject, prevent him away from the public vision which he has hitherto been schooled. The Orphic myth proposes a return to the undifferentiated debate before sexual identity arises, promising to deliver us back inside the ambit, to become in a Lacantian sense homeless. There is indeed, as admitted in the Orphic cult, something dangerous and self-destructive about this path. However, the most holy is beyond sex and gender. This is a thing we have already seen and will see more. In Egypt, we saw creation as an act of masturbation from a tomb. The prima donna at tomb is beyond sex and gender. I will point to the androgynous trinity in Christianity too, and ancient gender equality. We know in the Platonic and Pythagorean tradition the monad is beyond gender, and God being held to no definition is in fact no thing. Sex and gender too comes from the fall and the movement down from the state of being. There is a kind of gender essentialism, but one in which not everyone has gender, and gender is something lower. We find all over the most divine starts to become androgynous. For example, look at Egypt's most well-known symbol, Sphinx. The Sphinx of Egypt is male in the front and female in the back. So moving on, we speak of Christianity. In the publication, we found the article on Traditionalist from Blaine. We find an article from Ramnelli titled Christian Platonists in Support of Gender Equality. For articles very useful for us here. One should avoid the trap of people like the slimy incel Nick Fuentes want you to fall into. It may come as a surprise to much of the idiotic right wing, but Christianity is not a religion about putting women into the kitchen, even if small parts of the Old Testament and sections of Paul can make it sound like that. Nick Fuentes, if he even cares to cite the Bible, may cite Colossians, where Paul says, wives submit to your husband, and husbands love your wife. First, I want to point out that in this context, Paul focuses on telling us to focus on things above and not things that are lower. And he says before that line, where in Christ, where there is neither Jew nor Greek, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but in Christ all is all and in all. Keeping in mind, speaking to the Galileans, he adds, there is neither male nor female. Keeping in mind, Colossians also says that slaves should obey their masters. And I would personally cite the book of Philemon to argue that Paul is not pro-slavery, even though that reading is possible. So in Paul, sex is lower, even when we could read him as yelling at women to get into the kitchen. I think of how Plotinus speaks of civil virtues as he states, they ennoble us by setting bounds and measure on our desires, sensibility, and dispelling false judgment, but only as long as we remain passing out our life here. For Plotinus, as for Paul, they are virtues, yes, but virtues of a lower kind. These kinds of views can take us into some problematic territory, as it kinda does in Plotinus and Paul. However, with Paul, there is more context and a lot more to be explained. I think Plotinus gets more problematic, and Paul less so, and we should probably avoid holding on to such views of rhetoric into the future. Moving past Paul first because the real author is unclear, we will just say Second Clementine or Pseudo-Clementine. It may be an error on the part of Bandoli not to make it clear the unclear nature of authorship, as anyone who has studied ancient philosophy knows authorship can get very messy. In chapter 12 of the second epistle of Clementine to the Corinthians, it says that the Lord said, "When of two you will make one, inside like outside, and outside like inside, and above like below, when you will make male and female one and the same being, so that male is not male and female is not female." This from Pseudo-Pope Clementine is a reference to the Gospel of Thomas where Jesus does say this. This does show some attitudes of early Christians, even if it's not written by Pope Clementine I, and the Gospel of Thomas is, for good reason, not in the Bible. Better we move to Origen. He states that Christ being Logos and wisdom can't be said to be male or female. The Christ Logos is both the creator of everything in absolute perfection. Origen believes that the souls do not enter sequences of different bodies as envisioned by the theory of metempsychosis, but rational creatures have only one body, which is transformed in accordance with that creature's spiritual progress. The resurrected body will be very different from this one, yet it will be the same as the mortal body, not another. This body was initially neither Jew nor Greek, it was neither slave nor free, it was neither male nor female, and at the resurrection it will be the same. Our skin tunics are not a perfect ideal, but the result of sin. We have them thanks to their fall. At our highest, we have no gender and no sex. Origen makes some seemingly problematic parts of Paul less so. Commenting on 1 Corinthians 14:34-35, Origen remarks that, as Paul attested, women can be prophets and teach other Christians as well, only not in assemblies of men. Origen speaks of 1 Timothy 2:15, and for him, it's saying women will be saved through childbirth is not exclusive to women. Virginity that is not proud is a high virtue for Paul, as it is for Eckhart and Origen. So Origen is telling us, like Eckhart, to be a virgin who is also a wife. For Origen, there is no gender difference when it comes to spiritual gifts, as they come from purity of mind. Basil the Great believed in equality of the genders as they come from the same lump, like how Eckhart would go on to say, when God made people, he made woman for man's side, so that they might be equal. And keep in mind, the King James translators have a very sexist bias, not like Nick Fuentes thinking of women as something lower and Evola calling them the source of sin. Here man and women have the same virtues and the same nature. Gregory of Nicaea wrote The Life of Messina and On the Soul and the Resurrection. In both, the speaker is his older sister Maclina, and her being his teacher. This makes sense. Maclina and her colleague reached out for the angelic life beyond sex and gender. Gender is here something that comes from the fall and from our irrational skin. like origin, we are told to be mothers who are virgins. Christ is beyond that. As he is human perfection, this kind of Christology enabled, at least theoretically, an anthropology that transcended gender differentiation and discrimination. You may have seen his face before Robert Pelosi of YouTube likes to recommend him in some popular books. He teaches at Stanford and they have uploaded his lectures on human behavioral biology. Today we are only looking at lecture 15 on sexual behavior. Between 39 and 42 minutes, he brings up sexual dimorphism in the brain. 1 hour and 15 minutes and he brings up this again with the studies of LeVay, as LeVay found this kind of sexual dimorphism in gay men that you find in women. And even if that data is missing a big part of the picture, the data would go on to be replicated. And now you have a theory as to one reason gay men may be gay is prenatal hormone exposure. 7 minutes later, he speaks on the political influence of the work and the cool people who published it. And after that, the finger length in gay men being closer to women and also acoustic emanation. Before, at 1 hour 24 minutes, he brings in trans people into this. What is relevant stops about 5 minutes after that. As you may imagine, sexual dimorphism in trans people is not always like the sex that they are told they are. Both sex and gender are not a binary. Everyone knows about intersex people and some ignore the abuse done to them by doctors as they show us ways in which sex is not a binary. But I think data on trans people does the same. If I was an honest trans phobe but misled, I would ask how much like or not like women are trans women, and in what ways are they mentally like women. Sex does not just come down to the genitals, and female biology is not just having a dick. And men and women don't have the same brain. I look into how our brains may be different, and I may find something like women are likely to score higher on tests involving verbal skills and lower on mental rotation. So what if trans women predictably do the same? I could look at forms of sexual dimorphism like autoacoustic emanation or finger length and ask how much of that carries over to trans women. I know there are these tools, PubMed and Sci-Fi, I can use to grab papers. And I know that piracy is safe, so this is okay. An honest transphobe would have already done this, but them being dishonest perhaps means that what they say does not fall under free speech as I see it. I have just done this, and will now talk about some of those papers. And there's a video on my channel of me reading 3 of them. Starting with EQ 2020, here we have not much but data before and after treatment. So we find stuff like trans boys receiving cross-sex hormone treatment and puberty blockers, showed masculinized autoacoustic emanation for trans boys with no treatment being more sex typical. We could note that the cross-sex hormone treatment group had 21 trans boys, puberty suppressed group 26 trans boys, and 15 with no treatment. So, in trans boys before treatment, to be clear, in this study, they seem to be sex typical before treatment. However, treatment-naive trans girls tended to have stronger, thus sex atypical autoacoustic emanation than early adolescent boys. With these 10 trans girls and 15 boys, we find sex-typical autoacoustic emanation in the boys and sex-atypical autoacoustic emanation in the girls. But the authors would go on to say, due to the small sample sizes in our study, if that could be due to larger variability and should therefore be confirmed with larger sample sizes, this not being the strongest study I will look into more after the video, but this is just one I grabbed and read. Moving on to Sigmund 2020, having much more data, this looks at one of the other forms of sex-atypical sexual dimorphism that Pelosi spoke of in gay men. The finger length between the second and fourth digit. I will start with by saying one of the reasons many like to state for this atypical sexual dimorphism in gay men and trans individuals is prenatal hormone exposure. Not the levels, but the point at which they are exposed to said hormone. But the authors note that there is some criticism of using finger length as a biomarker of prenatal hormone exposure, and there are other mechanisms that may be involved in the development of 2D, 4D besides hormone and genetic. For example, prenatal cortisone and prenatal stress. As this paper uses single links as a proxy, it is important to note that in the first study we found significantly feminized 2D, 4D in male to female individuals compared to the male controls in the left hand, and not in the right hand, and no significant results of female to male individuals versus female controls. Then in the second study, more feminized 2D to 4D ratios among male to female individuals compared to male controls, whereas more masculinized 2D to 4D among female to male individuals compared to female controls. So both the original study and the meta-analysis supports our hypothesis that male to female individuals have higher, i.e. feminized 2D to 4D ratios than male controls. We also, like in the other, see that with female to male, we have a bit different data. Now we move on to the brain with 2022, looking at 24 cisgender men, 24 cisgender women, 24 transgender women for gender-affirming hormone therapy. Bigger than most studies in neuroscience, not bigger than that, as neuroscience often has small sample sizes. Here they use AI, and real AI, not just ChatGPT, with info on these brains. The AI generates a person-specific brain index, which is a number representing the degree of male femaleness on a continuum, 0 on the index being female and 1 being male. Here the brain of trans women was estimated to be a little bit closer to cis men, very sex atypical with a mean of 0.75 with a standard deviation of 0.39 on the ranking. Thus, trans women's brain is more male, but still does not fit in the male box. More on the brain with a wall of researchers and some meta-analytics, some giga-analytic fun. We have Mueller 2021. We have here a sexy large amount of data, and to make things interesting for our purpose, non-hormonally treated. We also have another theory noted by the authors than the prenatal hormone one I told you. The idea is that the differences between transgender and cisgender people are not anatomical differences inherent to sex assigned at birth, but rather linked to brain correlates of how one perceives the body in relation to one's gender identity. From my opinion, as a layman who sometimes reads smart man science papers, I think this is very believable for at least some of the data. Here, in the first pattern, we see cis men not being like cis women or trans men. The next pattern, trans women and trans men being more like cis women than cis men. Pattern 3, trans women aren't like cis men or cis women. In pattern 4, they are all kind of different. And in the last one, trans people are being very sex typical. From previous research and currently it seems that trans people have a sexually typical brain that doesn't fit in the boxes. There was also a really old paper from the 90s I downloaded and read but did not include in this. So, why did I go over these studies? It was not because I wanted to show how smart I am, but I wanted to make 2 points. First, like how fraud and slander don't fall on the free speech, and it would be insane to argue they should. I don't think misinfo and attempts to mislead, whether intentional or not, should fall under free speech. PubMed is out there, Sci-Hub is out there, and piracy is base. Ignorance is a choice. These were not hard to find, like top page stuff when you search, nor were they hard to read. You saw me you can go see me get through 3 of them within an hour, and I intentionally read slowly. Transphobes don't even do this basic level of research, and if you are a public figure, you have a duty to fact check yourself. If you don't do this, and you just reply with some shit like, define a woman, I don't think your hateful speech counts as free speech. If you can't do this, you need to be in a retard home. And it is amazing you didn't die as a baby from being able to find a kid. If you can and don't, then there is no reason to listen to you. You are clearly not speaking honestly on the topic when you speak on it. Lies and misinfo are not free speech. The other point I wanted to make was a reply to that teleological point, or Evola's point with Dharma, that if you have a dick, you must play out the role of a man. So, the problem is that, of course, biology is not just dicks and vaginas and sex and gender is not just dicks and vaginas, nor is it XY chromosomes, but a series of factors. And if your claim is that biology affects the natural teleology of a person, and so they must act ethically in a certain way to fit in with that, then I point out that trans people are often very sexual atypical, which would then thus affect their telos. And you would have to say that their telos must also be gender atypical. Now, if you would, you could probably look at my fifth, as it not only includes the sources, but as well more information on the topic. And with that, your favorite faggot is out of here.
And when somebody says, apologize for this or that, you say, no. I regret nothing. I regret nothing, and it's a good answer.